Hello everyone. Welcome to this conversation, and thank you for joining us. And we're very honored to have Dr. Mitra with us. The conversation, as advertised, is about migration, refugees, forced migration, and Afghan refugees in um, essentially in Iran. And so there are a number of reasons why this seems like a nice kind of time to talk about this and step away from this big debates that dominate our world. Global geopolitics, US-Iran relations, sanctions, regime politics, they often take like the center stage of all conversations. While like issues with forced migration and migration, there is very little space to actually sit down and discuss these lived experiences of actual people. So what we want to do today is focus entirely on refugees, economic integration, and Afghan refugees and migrants living in Iran. I mean, I keep using the word refugee and migrant at the same time until I pass on to Dr. Mitra to tell me which is the right term to use, because I got confused as I continued reading about Afghans in Iran. So we want to understand, their lives, the challenges, the landscape of perspectives and views that shape, the bigger debate about economic integration of migrants and particularly about those challenges with the host country. And in this case, we will kind of delve into Iran as well. So as you can imagine, there are kind of two overarching themes that we will follow. The second reason is the conversation is the timing of it. Since 2025, it feels like there is a huge rise in deportation of Afghans, and there's a rise in anti-Afghan sentiment inside of Iran. So they have, Afghans have lived in Iran for, I don't know, more than 40 years. And they have experienced different cycles of, tolerance and restrictions and so on. But this time, the scale of it, the visibility of it feels different. And maybe this is to do with social media that is able to amplify these narratives, or maybe something else that we will get into. And the third reason why this conversation is, I think, very important right now is the situation inside of Afghanistan. Since the return of Taliban to power in mid 2021, political repression, economic collapse inside of Afghanistan, and various other factors have made life increasingly difficult, leading to new waves of migrants and refugees into Iran and the rest of the world. So on the other side of the coin, Iran itself is feeling a lot of, as a country, is feeling a lot of pressures. So economic strains, sanctions, political pressures. What we are interested is how these pressures kind of shape the attitude of the people, so essentially the society and the state towards migration and refugees, and how much of that is scapegoating, essentially. So with all of that, very welcome to our guest, Dr. Mitra Naseh again. She brings deep expertise on forced migration and refugees, economic integration. So what we will do is first we will discuss with theory and findings and what the literature says on this. And then we can discuss the specific case of Afghan refugees in Iran and move into that area as well. So with that, one final note. This is slightly different in terms of format to our previous public lecture series. So this is a conversation. Therefore, I don't think we have slides or, a academic presentation. So we will converse as we go forward. Okay, over to you. Let's begin.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'm Mitra Naseh. I'm an assistant professor at Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis, and I'm the co-founder and director of the Forced Migration Initiative, which is a network of forced migration scholars. I'm really happy to be here and very much looking forward to this conversation.
Great, great, thanks. So let's start with the economic integration. So let's actually
Mhm.
start with these terms. Could you elaborate and tell us a little bit about refugees, migrants, asylum seekers? Forced migration is an additional
Yeah.
term in my vocabulary because I don't think
Yeah.
I've ever used forced migration before.
Yeah.
What are the differences? What is the right term we should use? And also, if you can link it to the situation of Afghans in Iran, what is the term that is used or the terms that are used to describe them?
Yes, yes. So the primary difference between forced migrants and immigrants in general is the concept of being forced to leave or making a plan to leave. So immigrants usually make a plan and have a motive to leave. It can be for economic opportunities, education, family reunifications. They pick a country, they get a visa, or they plan somehow legally or illegally to reach to their destination. For refugees, the situation, or first migrants in general, the situation is very different. They are forced. Something happened, and now they have to leave. War, conflict, human rights violation. Usually, their life endangering situation that they flee. If they stay within the borders of their home country, they are usually referred to as internally displaced people. If they pass an international border, they usually are recognized as asylum seekers or refugees. I prefer to use the term of forced migrants because refugees have a legal right, a legal right that it's recognized by an authority. It can be government of the host countries, the authority that recognizing the rights or giving the legal status for someone to become a refugee or be recognized as a refugee. And in some cases, it can be international bodies such as, for example, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees for a period of time in Turkey was the one who was recognizing who is refugee, who is not. Now it's the government of Turkey. So these things can also change. But in majority of the countries, the responsible body, the authority that recognizes who is a refugee, who is not, is the government. So the reason that I try to use the broader term forced migrants is that not necessarily government of host country usually do a good job in recognizing those who left because of well-funded fear of persecution and those who should be recognized as refugees. Oftentimes, they have other political motives to call a group a refugee and other group not, based on security concerns, economic concerns, political motives. So somebody being recognized as refugee or not, as long as they are forced migrants, they are the group that I believe deserve protection, deserve the right to stay in a host country, deserve to be protected and live in safety. The, beyond the fact that a government of that country considers them refugees or not. And asylum seekers are usually similar group as to refugees. They have similar claim. They're usually in the process of their claim being recognized by the governments. Until then, we call them asylum seekers, and this process can take years. For example, I work with asylum seekers in Turkey who have been asylum seekers for 5 years and still they're in the process of being recognized as refugees or not. So that process can be prolonged for a very, very long time. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. I think I will refer to forced migration from now
Yeah.
on. It
Yes.
seems like a much more comprehensive term that captures, all the various nuances
Yes.
and those definitions that who entitles people to those definitions. So it
Yeah.
captures all of them.
Yeah.
Okay. I think my second point would be tell us what is economic integration of forced migrants? Or when we talk about economic integration, in preparation to this talk, for the first time, I read about Afghans in Iran. And then I realized that I realized two things. First of all, I didn't know anything about the topic. And this was a very interesting area. And I stumbled upon a book that was fascinating, written by a guy inside of Iran as part of his PhD thesis. And the Farsi title of it was Dar Khane Baradar, which means in my brother's house. So it was talking to the broader arguments within the book that, after living here for 40 years, you're still a guest. You do not belong, kind of thing, kind of notion. So that was very informative. The second thing that was very informative was how much the conversation about migrants and forced migration in Iran resembles that of the conversation in the West. So I live in the UK, and there was so many resemblance and similarities that was eye-opening. So tell us, what do we mean by economic integration, and what are those discussions, the big discussions that shape this conversation?
Yeah. Well, this is a very interesting question because, as scholars actually do not have a consensus or agreement on what is economic integration. And very recently, I mean, not recently, in 2024, we published a paper titled Understanding Economic Integration, kind of defining what economic integration means for refugees. We spent 2 years reviewing literature to see how, as scholars, when they say economic integration or working on indicators of economic integration, what they actually look at. And then we published a paper, we came up with this 7 domains that scholars usually look at when they are referring to economic integration. Of course, one of the most popular one was income and employment, the first two. Like if they are employed, if they have income, and if their income is above the poverty line. But then there were other domains, if they have access to education, or if they are educated similar to the norm of the society that they are living in, if they have some level of health that help them participate actively in the economy, if they have proper housing. One other indicator that some researchers were looking at, if they're using public assistance, especially in the West. So saying that if they are not using them, then it means that they are integrated enough that they don't need them, which we argued against it, because when you're qualified for public assistance and when you're a new refugee in the Western country, resettlement countries, you need to use those benefits because they help you integrate better. So there are many domains that we talk about when we are talking about economic integration. And the reason that economic integration is such an important topic, at least for me, I believe that it's a cornerstone of integration in general. So it can really define the outcome in other domains of integration, like social integration. And in terms of Afghans in Iran, I think one of the vulnerabilities that one of the issues that make them really vulnerable is that the component of economic exclusion that happened for decades in the country. So the definition of to answer your question, the definition of economic integration is complex, really complex. And I want to look at it multidimensionally beyond the income and employment outcome, because there is evidence showing that you can be working, which is the situation for most Afghans in Iran, but still not be able to have the standards of living, that it's a normal standards of living in the country you're living in, because you're systematically pushed to work in low-paid jobs, because you are systematically denied of a specific rights. So income is not necessarily a good indicator to tell the whole story. Employment is not necessarily a indicator to tell the whole story. It should be multidimensional, looking at housing, health, education, um, standards of living, income, and of course, income and employment as well.
Okay, interesting. So essentially, economic integration is one part of a much bigger debate or a model of integration. So I mean, it seems like we have all, personally, I have experienced, moving to a different country and moving from Afghanistan to the UK and, um, and experiencing this firsthand and being in contact with it, whether I wanted or not. This was a constant theme that kept coming up everywhere I went. Um, Several studies that I also involuntarily kind of got exposed to and then ended up reading was a comparison of a model of integration between the UK and that of France.
Mhm.
So I'm just wondering, are there different, to just take one step back
Mhm.
from economic integration and actually talk about the whole
Mhm.
framework of integration and how we think about them?
Mhm.
What are the different frameworks? What are the different models? What does theory say on that side of things?
So, in terms of countries that are accepting first migrants, right? So, we have two models of countries accepting forcibly displaced individuals. So, there are a set of countries that are resettlement countries like UK, United States. So, when refugees, asylum seekers arrive in these countries, they potentially have a path to become citizen in this country. So their integration trajectory is very, very different from refugees and asylum seekers who arrive in countries like Iran or Turkey or Lebanon. So these are host countries. They only commit to provide temporary protection. So the concept of integration doesn't even exist in those countries because the legal framework does not exist. They do not accept refugees or asylum seekers with a path to citizenship. So, in a long term, have that legal integration, have similar rights to their citizens. Well, Iran at the time of open door policy, very short period of time, was giving similar rights to Afghans as Iranians, but it was very short and they changed it very fast. But Iran was never a resettlement country. So the integration for, let's say, a group of Afghans who have been forcibly displaced in the United States, in UK, and in Iran or even Pakistan will be extremely different. So integration will be superficial in host countries to the level that, okay, so we're going to have similar standards of living, but nothing beyond that. We'll never have similar rights. Whereas in resettlement countries, you're expecting to even have similar rights. I should add that less than 5% of refugees and asylum seekers have a chance to be resettled in resettlement countries. 95% of refugees and asylum seekers live in host countries under temporary protection because resettlement program, the way that it works, it has a quota. Each country accepts a very limited number, usually 1% of the people who are applying for resettlement actually get resettled. And it's a very lengthy process, can take between 10 to 25 years, the wait time, and that it has very restrict criteria. For example, some countries do not accept people with chronic health issues, which is like the resettlement should be humanitarian, but like it has all these restrictions, age restrictions, health restrictions, country of origin restrictions. So that's why only 1% get a chance to that. So these two models are the major ones that really differentiate between the trajectory of refugees and asylum seekers being integrated in their communities.
Fascinating. Just a quick follow-up on that. So essentially, how did that came about? So these two different categories essentially is the thing that I experience and we all as Afghans have experienced in the last couple of years more so than before, um, is for example being in Turkey for several years and not having any path to citizenship or further rights. Essentially, I say Turkey. I think the official term is Turkey now.
Yes, yes, they changed the
Um,
name.
so in Turkey, the immigration authority essentially issues a 6 month or a 1 year permit, which is a touristic permit.
Mhm.
And since 2000, as far as I know, I don't know if this was
Mhm.
happening before 2021, but from 2021 that I got to know, they were renewing a tourist visa for somebody living constantly in Turkey in different cities. While
Mhm.
there are limitations, in terms of which cities they could go and where they could settle and all the geographic um, restrictions. What I'm trying to understand is the differences in the legal systems that have emerged or measures that have emerged in the countries that do not have a trajectory for citizenship. So essentially,
Mhm.
I can imagine a country, let's say like the United States, with all of the troubles, about migration and so on and so forth. But we do have the institutions, the legal institutions, and the pathway that is established, and the law is there, right? That you come into the US and you have the right for an asylum, and then your case gets looked at fairly, and then there is a decision that is made about it, and essentially that forms the backbone of most legal institutions and pathways in all the second category that we talked about.
Yeah.
So the first category of countries that do not have this legal pathway,
Mhm.
they have resorted to various measures. So in Iran, you have Amaish, like the
Yeah.
card that is essentially preparation, like you're being
Mhm.
prepared for some sort of logistical kind of process. And then in Turkey, there was this touristic um, iqama that was being
Yeah.
renewed every year or every 6 months. And it was very unpredictable. The bureaucracy was very,
Yeah.
very strange. You had no insight into how they made those decisions. And the moment they rejected you, you become an undocumented
Yeah.
migrant and kind of subject to all the immigration enforcements.
Yeah.
So first point, how the two setups kind of came about. Why some countries
Yeah.
didn't adopt this system that emerged out of the Second World War or the post Second World War,
Mhm.
essentially. And the third is how much do you know about these different measures that have emerged in the countries that do not have that citizenship pathway?
Yeah. So part of it is possibility. Like US is a huge country and the average number of refugees that they resettle per year has been 65,000. So tiny, very, very tiny about compared to number that Turkey hosts or Iran hosts or they receive annually. And this 65,000 that they annually resettled on average came through years and years and years of a scrutiny, background check. They are not even, usually they are not in the US when they are applying. So the rejection case of those who apply by crossing the border is over 90%. So asylums who arrive at the border and apply for refugee, 90% of them get rejected in the US. So asylum seeking through border crossing is very unlikely. Yes, 10% get accepted, but the likelihood is very low. And yes, they get deported. They can appeal 3 times, so they can stay in the United States for a very long period of time because of the appeal, and each appeal takes years and years and years to be reviewed and reconsidered and a decision being made. So we are talking about the resettlement program of the US is usually works when refugees and asylum seeker are already in another country, for example, in Turkey, and then they say they are not safe there, they cannot live in Turkey with a justified reason, and they need to be resettled or they need to be reunited with their families. And that's the part that UNHCR they will enter the UNHCR process of resettlement to a third country, and we call it a resettlement program. And there are very few countries that are part of the UNHCR resettlement program, and it is usually facilitated by UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. So these resettlement countries are countries who have an agreement with humanitarian organization to resettle refugees who are unable to stay under temporary protection in their host countries. Usually that's the system that works. That's how they arrive into the resettlement country. For countries like Iran or Turkey, who are neighboring countries to conflicts happening in the region, they usually accept refugees on prima facie basis, meaning that if you are from Afghanistan and you're passing the border, you are recognized as refugees in it. At least this is how they were managing refugees years ago. Now the system is much more restrictive. They are even controlling border crossings. Usually people are not considered automatically as refugees because of their country of origin. But years before that was the situation. Recognizing that the conflict is happening in neighboring country, recognizing that their borders are closest to the safety, and letting people enter to seek refuge, to receive protection. And these countries historically have not been joining the resettlement program, not as receiver, but as the countries that are sending refugees to other countries for resettlement because of the capacity. Countries like Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, refugees are considered a portion of their population. If they provide a path to citizenship, their demographic will shift drastically. So that's a very big political concern that like if they become citizen, what will happen? They still provide some path to citizenship. Usually it's through marriage. So very small percentage of refugees in this country through marriage can receive a path to citizenship, but it's like very, very small, very, very tiny portion of the population. And again, those resettlement countries, Europe, yes, it seems that they are resettling large number of refugees, but when you look at the number, it's tiny. During the previous Trump administration, U.S. resettled average of 15,000, not even 65,000. So that average dropped to 15,000. Currently, U.S. suspended all resettlement programs. So our resettlement program is resettling zero number of refugees. So the number the number that get to be resettled is tiny, very small compared to those 95% that are in temporary protection situation.
Fascinating. I think this is a good segue and time into to transition into, more of Afghans in Iran.
Yeah.
Iran, we've established, I think if I understood correctly so far, is that Iran is one of the countries that doesn't have a resettlement program through UNHCR. It accepts Afghan refugees as well as Iraqis and other
Mhm.
refugees as well. So it's worth mentioning that Afghans are not the only refugees inside of Iran. And upon reading a little bit on this and not knowing anything prior, for about 40 years, I think I'm going to state what I read, and then if you can come in and then correct whether there is something missing in there or not. So essentially, I read that there has been three trends, if you like, in terms of the evolution of how the state policy towards Afghan migrants or forced migrants, refugees, have been shaped since 1980s. So one is open door policy. So at the
Mhm.
very early days, it's an open door policy. I think you referred to this as well earlier. And then the second, I read that it was I think the end of the communist era inside of Afghanistan, or just in the midst of the period where Taliban returned. Essentially, it was around that time when I think the policy of the regime in Iran changed to asking refugees to leave and to go back to their country. And this was known as, return to Afghanistan policy. Sometimes it was harsh, sometimes it was less harsh, but essentially that's been the official policy of the state. And then much later, let's say in 2000, I don't know, 16, 18, around this period, where the state realizes that you cannot return everybody. So there are some people who are going to stay and they've been here for almost 40 years. Now they've created an agency that is called Management of Afghan Refugees. So to try and figure out. But throughout this period, the policy of the state of Iran has been very ad hoc. There is no fundamental consistency. Sometimes it leads to in extremes, and then other times it's much more relaxed, and depending on who is at the helm of power. And recently, this has become much more visible and much more of a hot topic. And even little incidents are kind of attributed to the entire community of migrants. So, without talking too much, so essentially, my question is that a fair summary of the evolution of, the state policy? And clearly, there are elements in the society who are more sympathizing to the state policy. And then there are people who are less sympathizing to a state policy and doesn't follow that. So that heterogeneity exists within the fabric of the Iranian society, and those differences in terms of, attitudes towards migrants. How has that evolved? How much can you elaborate on that side of things?
Yeah, so definitely become more and more restrictive. If you look at the trend, as you mentioned, there was a very short period of time that Iran had like open door policy and a narrative that Muslim brotherhood and sisterhood, and we are going to save them from communist ruling in Afghanistan. So that was the narrative. And then suddenly we shifted to more and more restrictive policies. So, and the open door policies at the time was actually open borders. So Afghans, for a very short period of time, could actually pass borders without going through any justification that why they are passing border. That was a prima facie phase, that they were accepted as something is happening in Afghanistan. We are opening border to them. It was only after 1992, or mainly 1995, if you want to be like looking at very systematic way of controlling border crossing, that Iran started to look into whoever passes border needs to have a justification to pass a border, or controlling those borders. Some believe that like even the open door policy at the time was because Iran did not have the capacity to screen people at the border. It was right after the revolution. They didn't even have the resources to do so. It's not like they had an open policy out of the kindness of their heart. It was just like they couldn't. And as soon as they could, they put it in place. So we don't know. Out of necessity or out of sisterhood, Muslim sisterhood or brotherhood, there was a period of time that we had open border, and then we started controlling people at the border. And you mentioned Amish cards. Yes, in 2003, they put Amish cards in place. And then since 2007, it's almost impossible to get a new Amish card. They are just renewing the previously issued Amish cards. So those who arrived later often never received the refugee recognition. That's the issues. They were systematically given other status, which made them deportable over time. Because if you're not recognizing them as refugees, they are immigrants, they have temporary documents, it will expire eventually. And then you can say we are only deporting undocumented or underdocumented immigrants. Yes, because you didn't give them documents from the first place, because you didn't recognize them as refugees from first place. It's not like they did anything illegal or wrong, but like you put them in that category to be able to deport them later. Iran has started phases of, they call it voluntary repatriation. The question is that how much of it was actually voluntary, how much of it was forced. And now, in recent years, 2005, they are actually openly talking about, no, we are deporting. And they deport close to 2 million Afghans, and it's impossible for a country at the scale of Iran to actually process 2 million people and truly look at their documentation, to deport only those who are undocumented. So the estimates are like actually some legal refugees or relatives have been deported in the process. So it become more and more restrictive and more kind of hostile.
Very interesting. Do we know, before I have a number of questions there. So essentially it's a very similar to what ICE is doing in the US, if I'm not
Yeah.
mistaken. So let's say if you are somebody who by chance didn't get your card, Homage card did not renewed, and you've been living in Iran since 1980s or 1990s. So
Mhm.
your kids are born in Iran, and
Mhm.
probably they got married in Iran, and their kids are
Mhm.
born in Iran. So you have almost two generations
Mhm.
who are born and bred inside of Iran, whose social capital is inside of Iran, and whose
Mhm.
networks are inside of Iran, and this is pretty much what they know. And one of them gets caught by the police and gets sent to Afghanistan. This person doesn't have a home, doesn't have friends or circles, or doesn't know anything about the country, probably doesn't have a passport, Afghan passport. So examples of these are abound in recent years since the deportation kind of increased and the 2 million people that got sent back to Afghanistan. There are so many different aspects of this that we can explore. I think before I forget, one of the things that you mentioned, about the state's ability to control border checks and check people when they enter. I was reading that one of the so essentially that could be one of the reasons because it was immediately after the revolution. But one of the differences between, or one of the other inabilities of the state of Iran was essentially creating camps and sending Afghan refugees to camps,
Mhm.
which was very dominant in the case of Pakistan. So inside of
Mhm.
Pakistan, there's a huge wave of Afghan refugees who go there, and there are
Mhm.
various camps that are created. So one
Mhm.
argument is very similar to the Czechs' argument that once you create camps, you have to process them, have the bureaucratic capacity to
Mhm.
actually, provide, and there you have a higher risk of reputational risk as well.
Mhm.
You have numbers, you have statistics, and you have people, and then people can report on it, and UN agencies can say exactly what the state is doing. So one of the differences that Iran does in that 1980s is they do not create camps, and Afghans kind of go into the cities and various places inside of Iran to live. Whether it's the state's inability or whether it's intentional or unintentional, that we don't know fully.
Mhm.
Um, like I was saying, there are so many different aspects of this that we can dig into. One is there a kind of bigger landscape of different perspectives about migration that we can, try and place this debate? So
Mhm.
what are those big perspectives inside of Iran when it comes to migrants or Afghan migrants specifically?
When we were talking about like Afghans being like their second and third generation being born in Iran, somebody texted in the chat, Gul texted that is still no citizenship. Yes, generation after generation after generation of Afghans are born in Iran without citizenship. Just for audience that like it doesn't matter if you're a third generation living in Iran, you still will not get Iranian citizenship. You're born as refugees in Iran, and your children will be born as refugees in Iran, which is very sad. And thank you for Gul for mentioning that. And something you mentioned about the camps. So Iran's model is more popular in the world. Pakistan is an anomaly, and there are a few other countries that going with the camp-based model. Majority. So overall, in the world, less than 30% of refugee population live in camp settings. And then there's a difference between camp and settlement setting, which is like camps, your movement inside and outside of the camp is monitored. Like Zatari camp has that regulation that you cannot easily leave and come back. But there are settlements if you can easily go in and out. So it's not monitored and there's a freedom of movement happening like Bidi Bidi camp in Uganda. So there's also that difference in like settings that are set up by government or set up by refugees themselves, and then governments take over. But yes, government capacity is a big issue in actually managing camps if they have the resources, or international organizations are present enough to support that setting, which Iran sanctions and its geopolitical situation is making that also like very, very complex. They don't have the presence of humanitarian organization um, that can support those settings. So that's also another issue. Now, finally, going back to your question about the well, okay, I forgot the question. Was that about the public opinion about in Iran?
Essentially, yeah, the bigger perspective. So if we are to
Yeah,
place,
yeah,
attitudes, general attitude inside of Iran into different modes so we can understand it. So, for example, if you ask me that question about the UK, I would say there are three camps. One,
mhm,
completely anti-immigrant and anti-refugee,
yeah,
and these are one big group. They are
yeah,
not all similar. So the reasons within
yeah,
this group is slightly different. Some people try to justify their views of anti-immigration because
yeah,
of economic pressures and
yeah,
reasons, some because of nationalistic views, some
yeah,
because of culture, some because of race theory, etc., etc. Then we have this other big camp where people are generally pro-migrants, and the reasons within that is from moral, humanitarian to a whole bunch of other reasons. Even some economic argument that the contribution of the refugees. So if we were to kind of put the views inside of Iran into these different modes, um, to help us understand kind of the broader perspectives within Iranian society, what would be a good categorization?
yes. So I would like to look at it as a spectrum. So we have a group that are really anti-refugees and very xenophobic, kind of like violent even against Afghans, blaming them for all the issues in the country. And even starting campaigns about like we want them out. And there is at the other end of the spectrum is like that collectivist perspective that we are all humans, like we all have a right to leave, or even arguing that Iran is actually benefiting from cheap labor and oppression that it's happening towards Afghans. And there are people in between, right? And the government narrative also moves from this spectrum to that spectrum time to time based on the political benefits that they have. And they are currently more towards the xenophobic kind of a spectrum, blaming Afghan escape goating them for pretty much all the problems, blaming them for the war, blaming them for the economic situation and everything. So, and then you can see those who are more listening to the government moving to this side of the spectrum, those who are less listening to the government or are more critical of whatever government says might not be the truth, are moving towards the other um, end of the spectrum. And we have two texts in the chat. I don't know if you want to get to them, but like yes, go. It doesn't matter what Afghans do in Iran, how much contribution they make. Citizenship is not happening. Iran is very and and unfortunately, most of host countries, even in Turkey, the situation is similar, Pakistan, or many host countries, Lebanon, Jordan, because the fear, like if they give citizenship to one person, then what will happen? Which is not a true fear. I'm not defending it, but like that's the mentality behind it. And the perspective that like Afghans have to eventually leave. But like Afghanistan is not safe, where to leave? So that's another question. And to answer Dr. Assam, yes, there is a studies showing that extreme environmental factors are actually predictors of instability. So there is a huge overlap between extreme climate change and forced migration.
Okay, yeah, those are the comments in the chat. So if anyone else has comments, please do put them. We will pick them up as we go through. Um, because the conversation was kind of scheduled for 1 hour, so we'll try and make you know pick those comments as we continue. The other thing that I'm trying to understand is maybe it's a good time to actually move into that direction. Maybe we as non-politicians don't like to talk about politics as much, but there is this question that I'm very interested into exploring a little bit is the possibilities, or what are the future what does the future look like for Afghan refugees in Iran or any other host country, but particularly in Iran right now. So let's say if there is something that is happening. So let's say there are negotiations between the US and Iranian regime, and let's say this is successful. They reach some sort of settlement, and then their political pressure kind of eases down. So one of the reasons that we discussed that leads to these, shaping attitudes, society attitudes towards migrants. So let's say there is a deal, political pressure, it lessens on Iran, therefore economic pressure also lessens. Would that lead to a more favorable climate for Afghans? Number one. In a different scenario, number two is, let's say these negotiations break down and then we have some sort of full-scale confrontation between the two. And then there is various possibilities you could think of, from like a full-on war to a case of a regime change in Iran. So all of these different possibilities, what are the impacts of those situations? A situation that is instability, right? So what would be the impact of these two possibilities on Afghan refugees? Would they move back to Afghanistan? Do you have any observations there?
Well, I think over the years, Afghans systematically have been pushed to become one of the most vulnerable groups in Iran for many reasons. We know that there were a period of time that Afghans did not have access to education in Iran. We know that even if Afghans have legal documents, they only can work on specific fields that are usually labor intensive, lower pay. So systematically, Afghans have been pushed to corners or to the stage that they do not hold lots of economic power. Many of them are daily laborers, so their income depends to the stability that they would be able to work on daily basis. And again, I want to make sure that I'm contextualizing it as something systematic that government did. Government pushed them into that vulnerable um, position. So now let's say that the deal happens and the country is stable. Still, Afghans are at the grace of the government to recognize their legal status or give them small privileges here and there or renew their cards and not deport them. So they will just maintain the state of vulnerability that they currently have, which is not the strongest stance in Iran. The other scenario will be like Iran regime collapse. And well, just because they are one of the most vulnerable groups of society, they are most vulnerable to any sort of changes as well. So the hypervigilance or technically, sorry, violence or scapegoating can heighten towards them if there is like a struggle with the power. They are the weakest ones, so they may actually get pushed by whoever groups are fighting over power, and they can scapegoat them and they can also commit violence against them further. And the concept of going back where? Afghanistan is still struggling. For women and girls, definitely Afghanistan will not be the first option to go back to. Even for men, the economic situation is still very unstable, although in Iran the situation is similar. But then it remains neighboring countries who are not technically accepting refugees: Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan in the north. We have Pakistan, who is deporting at similar levels as Iran is reporting, and Turkey, who I think one of the motives of Turkey to reach stability in the region is not to receive more refugees at this point. And they are also having more and more restrictive immigration policies towards refugees. And we have Iraq, which is like it has its own issues and safety. What I'm trying to say is that the policies over the past 4 or 5 decades made Afghans so vulnerable in Iran that in any scenario, they still have lots of vulnerability, and they can be impacted by that.
Um, in terms of what can be done, so what would be the best outcome if or the best possible scenario that could happen that would be easing some of these restrictions on migrants or Afghans in Iran. Um, one of so referring back to the book that I read earlier, it's uh, other than reading the book, I listened to two debates on this same issue from two sides. Essentially, um, the argument is always missing on the benefits and the contributions, the economic contributions of migrants in Iran. And you have these array of statistics that are being used to kind of further the anti-migration rhetoric. Uh, but coming from an economist background and dealing with statistics and numbers, I know how misleading numbers are. So
Mhm.
and how without analysis they are just meaningless, and without contextualizing you cannot apply some numerical result to general population of
Mhm.
refugees, which is pretty much what's been happening on the other side of the aisle inside of Iran in all the debates that I saw and read. And in terms of like thinking about the future and moving, like what would be a You said it's a systematic issue, systematic isolation and scapegoating and lack of regard for Afghans inside of Iran. Um, Let me break it down like this. At an individual level, what would be your advice for people how to think? So let's say somebody in Iran is listening to this conversation right now. How should they think? Number two, at the society level, I think what are the things that we could do in terms of, for example, migrants organizing civil societies, and are there opportunities like that inside of Iran? And then thirdly, at the state level, what can be done? Are there any leverages that can be pulled to make the situation better for Afghans inside of Iran?
And I think we also have a question in this regard that Hamza Niazi wrote that what Afghans in Europe can do. So that's another layer. For me as an academic, I believe documenting, talking about realities, countering the narratives, political narratives, bringing facts, encouraging critical thinking. Those are the ways that you can create a space for people be seen, create a space for Afghans, highlighting Afghans' contribution. And yes, civil societies historically, non-governmental organization and humanitarian organization played a big role in protecting the refugees' right. Even access to primary education for documented and undocumented Afghans in Iran happened after years of campaign and work by non-governmental organization that led to a school door being opened. And then when lots of humanitarian organizations left Iran because of sanction, the situation got worse. So talking, documenting, advocating, writing about it. And then we also have one person writing in a chat that he can talk about situation of Afghans in Turkey. Definitely reach out to Dr. Rahimi and share if you have like expertise in this area, such panels that we talk, we brainstorm. Somebody wrote that they appreciate that they heard a different perspective. So when we are hearing different perspectives, seeing things from different perspective, the initiative you have, Afghan Resilience Network, or am I saying that name wrong? Those are very important initiatives that connect people, bring critical thinking, create a space for different perspectives, and then documenting the truth and advocating for it, talking about it. So everything that sometimes in Iran, part of the uprising is this campaign that don't stop talking about Iran. So don't stop talking about Afghans.
That's a great way into towards the end of the conversation. We've already gone 1 minute over the allocated time. I want to take the opportunity to actually thank all of our guests and also participants for listening and for being here and contributing. What I want to do is two reflections just to echo what you just said. One is the role of education and critical thinking, be a critical thinker. So this can be done through all the mediums and platforms available, from documenting to, books, articles, art, literature, etc., etc. And then the second is essentially not forgetting and talking about it. And I know there is little space because the center stage is usually taken by these big debates, but talking about it and remembering it. I think the last words, I want to give it back to you. Is there anything you'd like to add? Anything that I missed that I didn't ask? This is for you to we started 5 minutes late, so we will add a couple of minutes to our conversation. So take the time to add anything that I may have missed to ask.
Um, Nothing specific about the conversation, but I just want to put this quick note that if you're interested, any one of the participants interested in joining the newsletter of Forced Migration Initiative, please reach out. Well, my email address and everything about me is completely public. You just need to Google my name. We have an initiative, we send out newsletter about research, a specific research regarding refugees. And my research is heavily focused on Afghan refugees. And if you have other opportunities or you're in a spaces that can provide other resources, let me know. I would love to amplify the work that you are doing as well. And I want to sincerely thank you for creating this space. And the work that you're doing, this is very important, especially at this time. I have an article for the New Humanitarian, and we are comparing a couple countries and how their policies become more restrictive toward Afghans. I really believe that the world is starting turning its back towards refugees and specifically Afghans. And this is not fine. We need to talk about it. Afghanistan is still not a safe space for many Afghans, so they need to receive the protection they deserve the protection, and it's a responsibility of other countries.
Yeah, thank you. And with the hope that someday we have a stable system that actually respects Afghans' rights inside of Afghanistan as well. Just want to say end by saying that Afghanistan Research Initiative actually works on producing knowledge and research on Afghanistan, and we will carry these talks over. So please stay tuned and join us for other conversations that we will have. Okay, thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you
Mitra.
so much.
It's a
Thank you.
pleasure talking
Thank
to you
you.
as always.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us.